Okay guys, I am going to break all of the rules today. Are you ready? I don't have 5 books for this video. I have 6 books. I know, you're shocked, you're concerned, you don't know what to do. Let's just get into it. So this is a really weird list of books. There are some new releases on here. There are some older books. There are some books that are very recent. Like time-wise, there are some books that are really back at our founding even. But I really do feel like this is a group of books that is me starting to investigate how we tell the American story, like writing the American story in different ways that people have approached that, and why that's incredibly difficult. So I'm gonna start off with a book that maybe is not part of that project, and then we'll get into the ones that I think talk a little bit more to each other. So first, Misfire, Inside the Downfall of the NRA by Tim Mack. And if you didn't see my podcast recommendation video, I waxed very poetic about how much I love the NPR Politics podcast. And I literally only picked up this book because Tim Mack is a frequent-ish person who has shown up on that podcast in the past, and I really liked him. I know that he does investigative journalism, and I was like, well, I'll just look into this. Obviously the audiobook was only 9 hours, and one of its, I think, pluses and minuses is that it even, like, don't know if it reads like one, but it listens like a long form radio piece, and it makes it very, very readable. I read that or listened to that so fast. In terms of what the book is about, the title probably gives it away. Mack was one of the first investigative reporters really starting to talk about the NRA and their money problems and their ties to Russia. And so he's been investigating the NRA for quite some time. And this is a book really stringing together all of the pieces that he and other investigative journalists have done about the NRA leading up to approximately the present time. Because there has been a huge shift in the NRA's politics towards something that was bipartisan, just about the Second Amendment. Didn't matter if you were a Republican or a Democrat, the Second Amendment, period. And as the group has gone forward, it has become more of a partisan organization, specifically leaning towards the Republicans. And he documents that. He documents the leadership that got them into the financial pickle that they're in today and some of their financial scandals. I think, like I said, because it reads like a long form radio piece that Mack investigated over time, the structure of it is very odd. Like it starts off and there's some like important people profiles, and then there's some prose, and then there's more profile, and then there's more story, but the story sometimes repeats itself because some of the later story came out when they were explaining the life of the important person earlier. It was really odd, and maybe I wouldn't have noticed it as much if I hadn't listened to it in just a few sittings, but it was weird, and it was a little bit frustrating because I was like, okay, I know this, just move on. Like, you already told me this. Why are you telling me this again? I didn't forget, I'm not that dumb. But Mack's tone is also partisan, in a more, maybe he's going for more freedom than he gets on NPR, I don't know, but his opinion, his dislike of the NRA really comes through. He uses some choice words, not like swears, but some fairly strong language to describe their practices, as is his right. I've talked about this in videos before where I honestly prefer that people have their personal views right out in front, because it helps me to better understand the point from which they're writing so that I can critique the story, rather than saying, I'm impartial. No one's impartial, and I hate that people pretend that they are. But anyway, I have not been following the recent stuff going on with the NRA, so all of this was like headlines I had seen, but articles I hadn't really read. So it did, in a roundabout fashion, tie together some stuff that was new to me. It was interesting. I could have done without reading it also. It's not really a huge important piece of my knowledge, but I am glad that I read it. It was entertaining, at least. And it's knowledge that I have now about the NRA, I guess. So moving on to a new release from last year, H.W. Brands is a renowned historian, and he had a new book out last year called Our First Civil War, Patriots and Loyalists in the American Revolution. And this was a really interesting concept because I do think that we tend to talk about the American Revolution as, you know, there was the Americans versus the British, but obviously there were quite a few Americans, if you will, who lived in America and were loyal to the British, and it really did split families apart. It is more of a civil war, except that we weren't a civil union to split apart. You get the point. I was really excited about this book for that reason, particularly in the description. It talked about how the war broke up Benjamin Franklin and his son and his grandson, and they were three people who were really struggling. Obviously, Ben Franklin, I actually didn't know that he started his life as a super duper loyal British, America should always be a part of the British Empire thinker, and slowly came to be a loyalist for America, and like, no, America has to get away from Britain, because, you know, when we talk about Ben Franklin, he just seems like one of the ultimate patriots. And his son, through Franklin's connections, while Franklin was very pro-British, had become the governor of New Jersey, and he stays pro-British throughout the entire American Revolution, gets imprisoned, it's a thing, and Benjamin Franklin basically kind of steals his grandson away from his son and is like, I have to make this boy a patriot. So that, again, seems really interesting when I tell you about it. The thing is that the text itself is a lot of repeating first-person sources, which is interesting if you are looking to know how John Adams or Benjamin Franklin or even some people who, you know, their names aren't as familiar to us, but they're a huge part of this story, what they wrote, what they said, what they thought. However, Brands gives very little context. It ends up kind of reading a little bit like a series of vignettes, and also some of the more problematic statements. These people had, you know, obviously a very negative look at Native Americans at this time, and some other just problematic language that comes up that Brands never addresses. He just lets sit there. And I feel that this is a book of history without historical context. And that was really, really frustrating to read. So if you want to take a look at those first person sources and, you know, without having to do, I'm sure, the incredible amount of research Brands did for this book, it might be interesting, but it's certainly not a one-stop shop. I feel like I need to read another book on the same topic to really understand the political, social, just everything context really about what Brands is trying to tell us about the Civil War. So I started Wildland, The Making of America's Fury by Evan Osnos in last year, but I didn't finish it before my library hold ran out, and there was such a long wait list on it, I didn't get it back until this year. So this is definitely a book that spanned quite a long reading period, and if you missed it, I brought it up in a video that I posted on the Literary Gladiators YouTube channel, where I listed all of the 5-star books in my first 100 books in this series, which we met 2 books ago actually. Apparently I've read 102 books for this. But at the time, my most recent 5-star book was Wildland. And you can go and watch that video for more on this book, and also for more 5-star reads cumulatively. But for right now, I have to say that what Wildland is this incredible look at the transformations in America in the last 10 years. So 2001 to 2021, and basically using September 11th as this moment of incredible American unity to 2021, where it feels like we are as divided as we have ever been. And he goes back to places that he has lived throughout his life, where he feels exemplifies these different flavors and shades and things happening in America. And so he uses Appalachia, Chicago, and Greenwich, Connecticut. Greenwich, Connecticut being the realm of the incredibly rich, Chicago being, and Appalachia both being different kinds of poverty, and just comparing and contrasting in a really interesting way the incredibly different lives of the people who have lived there and the incredible changes in their lives over the last 10 years, but also the incredible similarities of the people who live there and how they really want many of the same things, but they have different ways of thinking how to get there. And this is just a very human book. It's not one where he says, and in 2017 in Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, who was at one point the mayor of Chicago, maybe not in 2017, but that's not important. He interviews Rahm Emanuel, but he also interviews people on the street. So there's a great conversation between what like elected officials or politicians or whatever are telling Evan Osnos, and then what the people on the ground are saying, and their changes and their stories over the last 10 years. It's an incredible book. I cannot recommend it enough. I really enjoyed it. I think it was one of the most interesting, most human versions of this story that I've read. And, he's not trying to say one view is better than the other. He's just trying to say, like, America is huge. But at the end, we have some very specific things that if we all could get past these differences that we see, we could make a difference toward these goals. So it's not necessarily optimistic, because he's like, we just keep breaking apart and no one seems to really get that we could be working together. But again, I really enjoyed it. It was really, really well done. So after that, I read this book, and I literally just was listening to it because I had an audiobook going in my car and an audiobook going on my phone, which I listened to in my house, and they were too similar, which they're not in this video. I'll talk about them in my next one. But they were both on the American Revolution, and they were too similar. So I was like, what is available right now that seems interesting, that is on the topic, but isn't on the topic? And that led me to another book by Thomas Ricks, who is an author that I have read before, and I know him for military history, but this one is First Principles: What America's Founders Learned from the Greeks and Romans and How That Shaped Our Century. And this was really interesting because I'm in a PhD program right now where we are looking at the history of education, essentially, and how we use that to understand where our education system is right now and how we can make it better. Like, what are the pitfalls? You're looking at how you make curricula and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know what I expected from this book, but what it became for me is a book about the history of how education impacted the founding of America. Because people who thought similarly, for example, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, were people who supported very similar Greek or Roman philosophers. And people who thought differently, like Alexander Hamilton, he had this other view through a different Greek or Roman philosopher. And George Washington, who didn't have the education that Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Jefferson had, came to exemplify a very traditional idea of a Roman standard bearer. And he did that, for the social standing of it, because at the time, learning the classics, the Greek and Roman philosophers, that was what you did. That was the mark of a great learning. And while the bulk of it focuses on how the different philosophers they followed affected how they lived through the revolution and how they helped construct the country that becomes America, there is this bit at the end which is really interesting about what happens after the founding generation begins to die out and that view of education changes. It's really, really interesting. And when I started it, it was literally just a stopgap book. But if that is something that you are interested in, it's a very interesting view that I've not seen anywhere else in all of these books that I've read about the founding of America. And it was just, I really, really enjoyed this view. And especially as someone getting my PhD kind of in this. So that was great. So the reason that there are 6 books in this video is because in the line, I always do these in chronological order. And in chronological order, I read 2 books by the same author back to back, which is rare for me. But I wanted to talk about them in conversation because that's the only way to do it. So I started with Union, The Struggle to Forge the Story of United States Nationhood by Colin Woodard. And again, my PhD, my interest is not necessarily in the history of America, but how different people have represented the history of America and how we've written it and why we've written it in the way that we have to kind of construct American identity. I'm very fascinated by this especially in our current fractured state of America. You know, we're all Americans, but it's just, we've got so divisive and yet fundamentally so many strong ideas about what makes an American. Anyway, that's a dissertation someday. But this book was purportedly about the different historians who have written the first real histories of America, how they wrote it, how history, the subject of history, the design of history, the curriculum of history changed over time, and thus the story of America's founding and its history changed. It was that, I guess, it took a really, really long time to get started. It had a really slow beginning. By the time I got to a more present moment, like with the Civil War and the Lost Cause and all of that starts happening, it seemed to start flowing a little better. And I don't know why that was. I was more interested in these people who wrote the first histories of America, but that first part was just really choppy and it wasn't that great. And I was like really disappointed in it, honestly, until I hit like the halfway point, and then it kind of rolled home really strong. So I am glad that I read it. I do hope to find another book on this topic to expand on this. But a lot of Colin Woodard's argument in this book is centered around what I believe is his most famous book, just based on reviews and stuff like that. I wouldn't say that that book rests on that argument, then you have to read this other book that I'm about to talk about. But I feel like had I read this other book and then read Union, maybe it would have made more sense to me that he was building off an earlier book and not just writing that book, if that makes sense. So he wrote American Nations, A History of the 11 Rival Regional Cultures of North America. And this book was the exact opposite of Union, where it was really, really strong and interesting. And then it kind of fell down at the end when I felt like his conclusion just seemed weird with the points he was making in the rest of the book. But the points that he makes in the rest of the book are that, we talk about these dichotomies in America, right? Like these binary east, west, north, south. And his contention is that on the continent of North America, there are actually 11 regional cultures, and that these different cultures are about where people settled and how they settled there and what groups of people went where. These different regions cut across states and they cut across countries even, because at some points, there are more similarities with people who are technically in the US and Canada or the US and Mexico, but their cultures are so intermingled that they're more like each other than they are like, people in New York or something. So I wish that I had not listened to the audiobook, because as he was talking, I felt like I really wanted to refer to the map, which is in the book. It's on the cover of the book, actually, but isn't, part of the audiobook. And I think that was really difficult. I have seen some issues with this where they're like, well, he clearly doesn't like the South. And I would say no, he doesn't, but he also says from the beginning that he's from Maine, or somewhere in the Northeast. And so part of the point of that book is that some of these cultures are so diametrically opposed that they have difficulty seeing eye to eye with the other. So I just find like his announcement of where he's from and what culture he belongs to kind of just makes his point. But whatever. It's not like he's like, oh, South bad. It's not like that at all. But anyway. Also, again, I'm saying the South, but there are like multiple regions in the South. It's a whole thing. I do feel like this is one of those books that broadens the discussion, right? If we're talking about, you know, North v. South, East v. West, and how many people feel left out of that discussion because they don't really subscribe to like the South or the North or the East or the West. And this 11 cultures really, I think, you know, it's still very broad strokes, but I think it gets more to our divisions as a country, and really I think helps remind us that America is big, you know, a lot like the Osnos book, just in a more historical minded book. So I'm not sorry that I read Union, but I wish that I had read American Nations first. I also wish that American Nations had a better ending. Just don't read the conclusion, maybe. It didn't go anywhere and it was weird and I didn't like it. But again, it's one of those books that I think will help push the envelope on these conversations and give more nuance to conversations in a country as big as America, and how similarly and yet differently we think, and the historical roots of some of these divisions and divides and ways of thinking and being. So this has been a really long video. I'm sorry. There were 6 books in it. I hope that you enjoyed. As always, if this is your first time or a recent time, there is a whole playlist of these videos where I talk about different nonfiction books dealing with American history. It's getting broader all the time, but I'm having a really good time with it, and I can't stop, won't stop. So if you have any suggestions on other books you think I should add to my list, let me know down in the comments. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Bye!